My name is Ava, and I'm 29 now. I've been carrying this burden for so long that I feel like writing it down might finally help me release some of the weight. This story starts when I was just a child, living in a home that on the surface seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, it was anything but. I have a half brother, Ethan, who is 13 years older than me. I was 5 when my mother, Olivia, married Ethan's father, Mark, and everything in my life started spiraling downwards. Ethan was already a teenager by the time they got married, and though I don't remember everything from back then, one thing I could always sense, even before I understood it, was that Ethan hated me. His disdain for me radiated from every glance, every word, and every action. At that age, I didn't know why he felt that way, but as I grew older, the reasons didn't matter. What mattered was the fear he instilled in me, and the emotional and physical torment that became the fabric of my childhood. Ethan didn't waste time hiding his contempt. It started small, name calling, hiding my toys, subtle ways to make me feel insignificant. By the time I was 8, it escalated. He pushed me around, slapped me, and pulled my hair until I screamed. But what cut even deeper than the physical pain was the verbal abuse. He made me believe I was worthless, that nobody, not even my mother, cared about me. My mother, Olivia, was beautiful and successful, but she was distant. She barely acknowledged what went on in the house. To her, as long as everything appeared fine on the outside, that's all that mattered. I could stand in front of her, bruised and tear-streaked, and all I'd get was, "Don't exaggerate, Ava. Boys will be boys." Her indifference was perhaps the greatest betrayal I experienced in that house. Ethan's cruelty continued unchecked because no one believed me or intervened. My mother turned a blind eye to every instance of abuse, chalking it up to sibling rivalry and telling me to toughen up. It got worse with time. When I turned 14, Ethan's behavior shifted in ways that made me feel unsafe in a much darker way. He no longer just shoved me or whispered cruel things in my ear. His touches lingered, and the way he invaded my personal space was unmistakable. I didn't know how to put it into words back then, but it made my skin crawl. I'll never forget one day, just before I turned 16, when I decided to confide in my only friend, Mia. She was the only person I could trust, and though she didn't know the full extent of what I was going through, she knew enough to realize something was wrong. When I told her everything about Ethan, about the fear, the abuse, she was horrified. She insisted I get help and even convinced me to talk to a school counselor. I was terrified, but with Mia by my side, I went to the counselor and told her everything. For the first time in my life, someone listened to me. I thought this would be the turning point, that someone would finally step in and save me from the nightmare I was living in. But life doesn't work like that. Child Protective Services, CPS, got involved, and a few days later, they visited our home. I was petrified, sitting at the dining table with my mom and Ethan as the social worker asked questions. Ethan, ever the manipulator, played the part of the caring older brother perfectly. He smiled, answered politely, and even gave a concerned look when talking about how we occasionally fought like normal siblings. My mother, unsurprisingly, backed him up at every turn. By the end of the visit, CPS decided that there were no immediate concerns, and they closed the case. That night, Ethan cornered me in the hallway. He whispered, "You thought they believed you? Look where that got you." Then, he dragged me to the guest room and locked me inside. It became a regular occurrence after that. Ethan would lock me in various rooms, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. It was never just about confinement. It was a constant reminder of his control over me. He'd destroy my things, rip apart school books, tear up my journal, and once, he threw all my belongings out the window during a rainstorm. I'd return home from school to find my shoes soaked and my homework ruined. Nothing I owned was safe from his wrath. But the worst of it all? Ethan threatened my pets. I had a cat, Luna, and a hamster, Teddy. They were the only creatures in that house that made me feel loved and safe. Ethan, knowing how much they meant to me, used them against me. He'd lock Luna in the closet for hours, and once, he shook Teddy's cage so violently that the poor hamster tumbled around, terrified. I tried again to tell my mother. This time, I was desperate after Ethan had hurt Teddy. She barely looked up from her phone when I tried to explain. Ava, you're being dramatic, she said dismissively. Ethan wouldn't hurt you. He's just teasing. That was the last time I ever tried to ask her for help. I knew then that she wasn't going to protect me. She never would. By the time I turned 16, Ethan's torment had reached unbearable levels. He no longer pretended to be anything other than what he was, my tormentor. My mother's endless dismissal of every plea for help had crushed whatever hope I had left. I was alone, but there was one person I had almost forgotten about, my older half-brother Daniel. Daniel had left when I was young. He wasn't close to our mother, and after she remarried, he disappeared from our lives. But I remembered how kind he had been when I was little, and I held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could help me escape. One night, after a particularly terrifying encounter with Ethan, I decided it was time. I packed a small bag with whatever I could carry and slipped out of the house in the middle of the night. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. I found a payphone, shaking as I dialed Daniel's number. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but when he answered, I barely managed to whisper, "It's Ava. I need your help." Daniel didn't hesitate. He told me to stay put, and within 30 minutes, he was there. When I saw his truck pull up, I broke down in tears. He hugged me tightly, telling me over and over, "You're safe now. You're safe." Living with Daniel was like stepping into a completely different world. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Daniel enrolled me in a new school and helped me catch up on my classes. With his support, I started to believe in myself again. But even with the physical distance, Ethan's presence loomed over me. I was constantly afraid that he'd find me and drag me back into that nightmare. Months passed, and I began to rebuild my life. I made new friends, started excelling in school, and even began to dream about a future beyond the walls of my past. Daniel was always there for me, never asking for anything in return. He became not just my brother, but my protector. Years went by, and I managed to finish high school, get into a good college, and start a career in marketing. Life had finally started to feel normal again. I was living in a cozy apartment, working as a marketing consultant, and for the first time, I felt truly free. But that freedom was short-lived. One afternoon, I received a text from an unknown number. It was my mother, and she wanted to talk. I hadn't spoken to her since I left at 16, and suddenly, after years of silence, she reappeared in my life. I ignored the message, but soon enough, more came. The next one was more direct. Ethan was in trouble, and they needed money. My mother's calls and texts became more frequent. She left voicemails, pleading for help. Ethan had gotten himself into debt, and she was desperate. But I couldn't believe the audacity of it all. After everything I had been through, after everything Ethan had done to me, they still had the nerve to ask for my help. I ignored the calls, but they escalated. One evening, I came home to find my mother and Ethan standing outside my apartment. My heart raced as I asked, "How did you find me?" Ethan, with that same menacing look he'd always had, stepped forward. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and threatening. I tried to stay calm, but my pulse quickened. "I have nothing to say to either of you," I replied, turning toward the door. But Ethan grabbed my arm. "You're going to give us the money, Ava? Whether you like it or not." I yanked my arm free and fled into the building. Once inside, I collapsed on the couch, shaking. I called Daniel, and he was furious. "They showed up at your apartment?" he asked, his voice laced with anger. "We'll handle this." Daniel wasted no time. He contacted a lawyer, and we filed for a restraining order against both Ethan and my mother. But Ethan wasn't going to give up easily. He and my mother started showing up at Daniel's house, pounding on the door and leaving threatening letters. I felt like I was right back in that house, living in fear of what Ethan might do next. But then something unexpected happened. A few months after the harassment began, Ethan was arrested, not for harassing me, but for something much worse. He had kidnapped a neighbor's child in a desperate attempt to pay off his debts. When I heard the news, I felt a mixture of shock and relief. Maybe now, with Ethan behind bars, I could finally feel safe. But even then, my mother refused to accept reality. She insisted that Ethan had been framed, that he was innocent. That was the final straw. I realized that I needed to protect myself not just from Ethan, but from her as well. With Daniel's support, I filed a lawsuit against my mother for financial fraud. Over the years, she had taken out loans and credit cards in my name, leaving me with a mountain of debt I hadn't even known existed. The lawsuit was a long and painful process, but in the end, I won. My mother was forced to pay restitution, and I finally cleared my name. With Ethan in prison and the lawsuit behind me, I finally felt free. Healing from years of abuse takes time, but with Daniel by my side, I was able to move forward. I built a new life, made new friends, and for the first time, I felt strong. I had survived. I had reclaimed my life, and no one, not my mother, not Ethan, would ever have power over me again.